The first thing my father said after I answered the phone was, "The bank's taking the house. What did you do?" His voice was sharp with panic, stripped of the cold authority he had used on me my whole life. In the background, I could hear my mother crying. Papers rustled. A television blared somewhere in the house. I remember smiling. Not because I was happy. Not because revenge had ever been something I dreamed about. But because for the first time in 42 years, Frank Reeves sounded afraid, and I wasn't the one standing there shaking. I quietly ended the call. Then I looked through the window of my motel room at the gray Virginia morning and let myself remember how all of it had started. It had begun exactly 1 week earlier. At 5:03 on a Monday morning, someone started pounding on my apartment door hard enough to rattle the brass unit number screwed into the frame. I woke instantly. 20 years in Army intelligence teaches you to wake fast. For a moment I thought I was back in Afghanistan, half asleep in a plywood bunk, while incoming alarms screamed through the dark. My heart slammed against my ribs before my mind caught up with where I was. Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Officer housing. Stateside. Safe. Then the pounding came again. Major Reeves Military Police, open the door. I was already out of bed, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. My apartment was neat, everything exactly where it belonged. Habit, discipline, order had shaped my life for more than 2 decades. I threw on a robe and opened the door. 2 MPs stood there in full uniform. Behind them was a man in civilian clothes holding a leather folder. The older MP avoided my eyes. That was my first warning. The civilian introduced himself as Special Agent Thomas Keating with Army Criminal Investigation Division. "Major Abigail Reeves," he said, his voice clipped and formal, "you are being placed under immediate administrative suspension, pending investigation into unauthorized access and transfer of classified financial intelligence records." For a moment the words didn't register. Unauthorized access. Transfer. I stared at him. There has to be some mistake. I'm afraid not. He handed me papers. Legal language blurred across the page. My security clearance was suspended effective immediately. My command authority was revoked pending investigation. I was prohibited from entering secure facilities or accessing military systems. It felt unreal, like hearing details from someone else's life. I had spent 21 years building my career. West Point. 2 overseas tours? Bronze Star. Countless nights under fluorescent lights tracking financial trails through hostile networks. And now some stranger was standing in my doorway dismantling all of it before sunrise. "I want my JAG representative." "You'll have one by 800. The younger MP shifted uncomfortably. He knew me. I recognized him too, Private Morales, fresh-faced kid from Texas. I'd once helped him get emergency leave when his father had a stroke. Now he stood there while another man confiscated my government-issued laptop and credentials. That was how quickly dignity can vanish. By 6:30, the rumors had already started. Military communities are small. News moves faster than wildfire. By 7, I had 3 texts from officers asking if the allegations were true. By 8, silence. No one wants proximity to disgrace. I sat in my apartment until 10, staring at my blank television screen. Then I did the one thing I hadn't done in years. I drove to my parents' house. They lived in Columbia, Maryland, in the same neat colonial home where I'd grown up. White shutters, blue hydrangeas, American flag hanging proudly from the porch. Frank Reeves believed deeply in appearances. A polished lawn meant discipline. Pressed shirts meant respectability. Children who succeeded reflected well on their parents. Children who stumbled were an embarrassment to be corrected. I had spent most of my life trying to earn his approval. Even West Point hadn't fully done it. He'd shaken my hand at graduation and said, "Not bad." That was the closest thing to pride I'd ever received. I pulled into their driveway just after noon. For a second, sitting there with my hands gripping the wheel, I was 16 again, hoping home would feel safe. I rang the bell. My mother answered. Elaine Reeves looked smaller than I remembered, softer somehow, her silver hair pinned neatly back. The moment she saw my face, her expression changed. Fear. Not concern. Fear. "Abby." "Mom, I need to talk to Dad." She hesitated. Then my father appeared behind her. Frank Reeves looked exactly as he always had, straight-backed iron gray hair, crisp button-down shirt tucked neatly into pressed slacks. Even retired, he dressed like the world was watching. His eyes landed on me, then narrowed. I saw the news. It isn't true. Military police don't show up for innocent people. I stared at him. Dad, I'm being framed. He folded his arms. You've brought enough shame to this family. The words landed harder than I expected. My mother looked down. Not defending me. Not saying my name. Just looking down. Then my father said the sentence I will never forget. Don't drag our family name down with you. I laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. Are you serious? Without answering, he stepped outside and dropped my old deployment duffel bag onto the porch. I stared at it. What is this? We cleared out the things you left here. Confusion hit me first. Then dread. I reached for my phone and opened my banking app. Balance $413.72. I froze. Number. No. The account had held nearly $80,000. Savings from deployments. Combat pay. Years of careful planning for retirement. My father had co-signed emergency access years ago before my first deployment in case something happened overseas. I looked up at him, my pulse roaring in my ears. You emptied my account. We protected family assets from seizure. My mouth went dry. That was my money. It was under our family name. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said, calm, as if discussing weather. Never use our family name again. My mother began crying quietly behind him. But she said nothing. And somehow that hurt more. I picked up my duffel. No shouting. No pleading. Military training teaches control. So I turned and walked back to my car. I drove south until Maryland disappeared in the rearview mirror. By nightfall, I checked into a roadside motel off I-95 with faded floral bedspreads and humming fluorescent lights. And for the first time since I was 18 years old, I had nowhere to go. That was the night I realized something harder than betrayal. Sometimes the people who abandon you were never really standing with you at all. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. That smell stayed with me all week. Even now, months later, I sometimes catch a trace of disinfectant in a hospital hallway or an airport restroom, and I'm right back there sitting on the edge of that sagging mattress with my army duffel at my feet, staring at a future that had gone blank overnight. The first morning after my parents threw me out, I woke before dawn out of habit. For 21 years, Reveille had been my clock, whether I was stationed in Virginia, South Korea, or halfway across a desert under blackout conditions. My body still expected purpose at 0500. Instead, there was only silence. No command schedule. No secure briefings. No morning reports waiting in my inbox. Just the buzz of the motel's ancient air conditioner and the sick feeling that my life had been paused by someone else's hand. I sat up slowly and reached for my phone. Nothing. No messages from command. No texts from colleagues. No calls from my parents. The isolation felt surgical, as if every thread connecting me to the world had been cut cleanly at once. For a while, I simply sat there and listened to the traffic passing on Interstate 95 beyond the window. Then discipline took over. I showered. Pressed my civilian clothes as neatly as I could. Made the bed. Small things. Order is often the only defense against panic. At 800 sharp, my temporary legal liaison called. Captain Laura Kim, Judge Advocate General's Corps. Her voice was professional but kind. Major Reeves, I've reviewed the preliminary allegations. And, a pause. This is unusual. That got my attention. How unusual. The access logs show your credentials authorized financial intelligence transfers at 02:17 hours last Thursday. I was asleep in my quarters. I know, base access logs confirm you never left your apartment. A quiet tension entered her voice. Someone either cloned your credentials or they had elevated system override access. I sat straighter. Which means this wasn't random. Number. For the first time since the MPS had appeared at my door, my fear sharpened into focus. I had spent years tracking financial fraud through military contracting systems. If someone had used my credentials to move classified financial records, they either wanted money Or they wanted me blamed for finding something I shouldn't have. Laura's voice lowered. Officially, I shouldn't say more, but unofficially, Major, this smells wrong. After we hung up, I stared at the wall for a long time. Then I opened my notebook. Paper, pen, old school. When systems are compromised, analog survives. I began writing every case I'd touched in the last 6 months. Defense vendors. Logistics contractors. Supply chain discrepancies. Payment irregularities. Halfway down page 3, one name stopped me cold. Redstone Federal Logistics. 3 months earlier, I had flagged unusual transaction layering through their overseas subcontractors. Nothing dramatic at first glance, just enough inconsistency to suggest laundering if someone knew where to look. I had submitted a recommendation for expanded audit review. 2 days later, I'd been told higher command would handle it. Then silence. Now I was under investigation. My instincts stirred. This wasn't coincidence. At noon, there was a knock at my motel door. Every muscle tightened. When I opened it, Colonel Daniel Mercer stood there holding 2 coffees. Retired 3 years now, Mercer had once been my commanding officer and the closest thing I'd ever had to a professional father. Tall and broad even in his 60s, with silver hair cropped short and eyes that missed nothing, he looked exactly as he had the day he pinned my oak leaves on my uniform. "You look terrible," he said. I almost laughed. That obvious? Abigail, I've interrogated cartel financiers with better posture. That made me smile despite myself. He handed me coffee and stepped inside. We sat by the window while morning traffic hissed past outside. He listened while I told him everything. The MPs. My parents. The missing money. Redstone. When I finished, he was quiet. Then he nodded slowly. I was afraid of this. My stomach tightened. You know something? Not enough to prove anything. He folded his hands. 3 weeks ago, a friend at the Pentagon called me. Internal oversight had concerns about procurement fraud tied to Redstone and several shell contractors. I felt my pulse quicken. How high does it go? High enough that if you got close to exposing it, someone would notice. The room felt smaller. You think I was set up? I think someone with system-level access used your credentials because they knew your audit flags would make you believable. He leaned forward. Listen carefully, Abigail. Truth in Washington moves slow, but it always leaves footprints. That sentence settled into me like an anchor. For the first time all week, I could breathe. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't disgraced. I was inconvenient. And inconvenient people get erased if they stop paying attention. After Mercer left, I worked. Not officially. Not on any military system. But I knew enough about contractor reporting structures to map likely shell pathways by hand. Hours passed. Outside daylight faded to dusk. Around 7, my phone buzzed. Dad. I stared at his name. Frank Reeves had not called once to ask if I was safe. Not once. Now his name glowed across my screen like a command. I let it ring out. A minute later, voicemail. Then another call. Another voicemail. By midnight, there were 6. I didn't listen. Not yet. Instead, I sat by the motel window and watched headlights sweep across the parking lot. Somewhere out there, powerful people thought they had buried me. At the same time, somewhere north in Maryland, my father was calling with growing urgency. For reasons I didn't yet understand, both sides had suddenly remembered I existed. And experience had taught me one thing. When people who've ignored you suddenly need your attention, the truth is usually about to surface. I slept with my notebook open beside me. And for the first time since military police had pounded on my door, I dreamed not of losing everything, but of getting it back. The 7th call came at 6:14 the next morning. I was already awake, sitting at the little motel desk with my notebook open and a stale cup of coffee cooling beside me. Dawn was creeping through the thin curtains, laying pale stripes across the carpet. Dad's name flashed across my screen again. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Then I answered, "Hello." The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to tell me he hadn't expected me to pick up. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded nothing like the cold, polished certainty I had grown up fearing. It was ragged. Panicked. "Abigail." Not Abby. Not that clipped, dismissive tone he used whenever he wanted to remind me I'd disappointed him. My full name. Like he suddenly remembered I was a person. "What is it, Dad?" There was a sharp breath. Then he blurted, "The bank's taking the house." I said nothing. Behind him I could hear my mother crying. Cabinet doors opening and closing. The low murmur of the television. Then his voice sharpened into accusation. "What did you do?" For a moment I didn't understand what he meant. Then memory clicked into place. 7 years earlier, right before my second deployment overseas, my parents had asked me to help them refinance. Dad had framed it as temporary, a smart financial adjustment while interest rates were favorable. "Just co-sign," he'd said. "It'll help secure approval. You've got stable military income." I had signed without hesitation. Because he was my father. Because family was supposed to mean trust. What I hadn't known, what I had never thought to check, was that after the refinance, he had quietly tied the mortgage autopay to the emergency account he had access to. My account. The account he had emptied the day he threw me out. The realization settled slowly. Heavy. Clean. The money that had kept their house afloat had been mine all along. And when he drained it to protect family assets, he'd severed his own lifeline. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the motel wall. On the other end, my father was breathing hard. "Well," he snapped. For most of my life, that tone would have sent adrenaline through me, the reflexive need to explain, obey, fix whatever he believed I had broken. But something inside me had shifted on that porch in Maryland. Some old chain had finally snapped. I smiled. Not cruelly. Not triumphantly. Just with the quiet recognition of truth finally arriving exactly where it belonged. Then I ended the call. No speech. No accusation. No explanation. Just silence. The phone buzzed again immediately. I muted it and set it face down. Outside, the Virginia sky was turning gold with sunrise. For the first time in days, I felt calm. Not vindicated. Not healed. Just clear. Some lessons don't need to be taught with anger. Reality usually handles that part just fine. I showered, dressed, and walked across the motel parking lot to the little diner next door. The waitress, a woman in her 60s named Sharon, had started recognizing me by then. She poured coffee before I even sat down. "Rough week." I gave a tired smile. "You could say that." She nodded like she understood more than she asked. That's something I've always admired about older Americans. The best of them know when kindness matters more than curiosity. I was halfway through my eggs when the television above the counter switched from local weather to national news. The headline froze me in place. "Pentagon Procurement Fraud Investigation Expands." The anchor's voice sharpened. "Sources inside the Department of Defense now confirm widening inquiries into financial irregularities tied to Redstone Federal Logistics and affiliated contractors." My pulse kicked. Sharon noticed. "You okay, honey?" I didn't answer. On-screen file footage rolled of Redstone executives entering a federal building. Then my own photograph appeared. My official army portrait. The diner went very still. The anchor continued. Earlier reports suggested Major Abigail Reeves was under investigation for unauthorized system access. New information indicates Reeves may instead be central to uncovering the fraud itself. The room blurred for a second. I gripped the edge of the booth. The anchor kept speaking. "Military investigators are now examining evidence that Major Reeves's credentials were duplicated by senior systems administrators linked to contractor oversight offices." A man at the counter turned and stared at me. Recognition dawned. I stood slowly. Then my phone exploded with notifications. Texts. Voicemails. News alerts. 27 missed calls. Most from numbers I knew. Former colleagues. Reporters. And my parents. The phone rang again. Dad. I let it ring. Again. Again. Then voicemail. I listened. His voice had changed. Gone was the accusation. Gone was the command. Now there was something almost unrecognizable. Fear and shame. "Abby," he said quietly, "please call us back. We didn't know." I stared at the message long after it ended. Then Colonel Mercer called. His voice was steady. They've arrested 2 oversight officials and frozen Redstone assets. I closed my eyes. It's over. Not quite. A pause. Then warmth entered his tone. But your name's been cleared, Major, officially. For a moment I couldn't breathe. 21 years of service. A lifetime spent proving myself. And now, in one sentence, my honor had been returned. I thought I'd feel triumph. Instead, I felt grief. For the child who had spent decades chasing her father's approval. For the woman standing on that porch while her family turned her away. For all the years I had mistaken endurance for love. Mercer spoke again. You all right? I looked out the diner window at the brightening Virginia morning. And for the first time in my life I answered honestly. Yes. I think I finally am. By noon, every major news network in the country had my face on their screens. It was a strange thing watching your own army portrait appear beneath a chyron that read, Decorated Officer Cleared in Pentagon Fraud Case. I sat in the same diner booth where an hour earlier I had been a disgraced major hiding in plain sight. Now Sharon kept refilling my coffee while pretending not to stare. The regulars at the counter stole glances in my direction, their expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition to something like respect. I wasn't used to public attention. Military intelligence is built on invisibility. If people know your name, something has usually gone wrong. And for one long week, everything had. Now the truth was surfacing faster than anyone expected. The television anchor explained how investigators had uncovered an internal network of procurement fraud stretching through multiple oversight offices. Redstone Federal Logistics had funneled federal money through shell contractors for years. When I flagged irregularities in their overseas payment structures, 2 senior civilian administrators intercepted my audit requests. Then they cloned my credentials, falsified access logs, and used my profile as a scapegoat. The whole operation had nearly worked. Nearly. But one of the men they trusted, a systems analyst named Victor Salinas, had panicked after seeing how far they intended to push the cover-up. He had turned state's evidence before dawn. His testimony had broken everything open. By 11:30 that morning, federal agents had made arrests in Arlington and Washington. By noon, my suspension was formally lifted. At 12:14, my commanding general called personally. Lieutenant General Howard Whitaker was not a man known for softness. He had spent 37 years becoming exactly the kind of officer history books remember. His voice came through measured and precise. Major Reeves. Sir. A pause. Then, you have my apology. The words landed harder than I expected. I appreciate that, sir. No, he said quietly, you deserved better. I stared at the motel wallpaper while emotion tightened my throat. That was the thing about real leadership. It doesn't hide behind rank when it's wrong. Whitaker continued. You'll report to Fort Belvoir at 800 tomorrow in full dress uniform. There will be a formal reinstatement and commendation. Yes, sir. Another pause. Then his tone softened. Well done, Major. The line clicked dead. For several moments I simply sat there holding the phone. 21 years of service had taught me that praise from men like Whitaker was rare and carefully earned. But all I felt was tired. Deep down tired. The kind that settles into your bones after surviving something your mind still hasn't caught up to. The next call came 3 minutes later. Mom. I let it ring. Then voicemail. Her voice was shaking. Abby, sweetheart, please call us. We were wrong. We didn't understand. A sob interrupted her. Then the message ended. I closed my eyes. The old ache rose instantly. That familiar pull to comfort her. To smooth over pain. To become the capable daughter who fixed everyone else's mistakes. But another voice quieter and stronger rose beside it. You do not owe people immediate access just because they suddenly regret hurting you. That truth felt foreign. Almost rebellious. And yet it steadied me. The calls continued all afternoon. Dad. Mom. Dad again. A text. Please, we need to talk. Another. The foreclosure notice was a mistake. There's more going on. Please call. I ignored them all. At 5 that evening, Colonel Mercer arrived at the motel. He wore jeans and a navy polo shirt, but somehow still looked like he was conducting command inspection. He handed me a garment bag. Inside was my dress blues. Pressed perfectly. Every ribbon aligned. Every insignia polished. I looked up. You had these cleaned, he shrugged. Thought you might need them. That nearly broke me. Not because of the uniform. Because he had noticed what I needed before I asked. That kind of quiet care still catches me off guard. Mercer sat across from me. You heard from your parents? I nodded. And, I don't know. He was silent for a while. Then he said something I've carried with me ever since. Abigail, forgiveness and access are not the same thing. I looked at him. He folded his hands. You can forgive someone someday and still refuse to let them keep hurting you today. The words settled somewhere deep. I thought about my father standing on that porch. About my mother looking away. About 20 years of trying to become enough for people who only measured worth by usefulness. And for the first time I considered a possibility I had never allowed myself before. Maybe I didn't need their approval to belong to myself. That night alone in the motel room, I carefully hung my uniform on the closet door. The dark blue fabric caught the yellow lamplight. Brass buttons gleamed. Rows of ribbons marked 2 decades of service, sacrifice, and endurance. For years I had worn that uniform hoping my father might one day see it and understand my worth. Now I understood something better. Its value had never depended on his recognition. At 7:42 the phone rang again. Dad. This time I answered. He inhaled sharply. Abigail. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I said nothing. Then he spoke the words I never thought Frank Reeves would say. I was wrong. Silence stretched between us. Then quietly, I should have trusted my daughter. Something inside me shifted. Not healed. Not whole. But softened. And for the first time since this began, I wondered if shame had finally reached him the way fear never could. I didn't forgive him that night. But I listened. And sometimes listening is the first crack where grace begins to enter. The next morning I stood in front of the motel mirror and buttoned my dress blues, one careful fastening at a time. The motions were automatic. Precise. Familiar. For 21 years this uniform had marked every turning point of my adult life. Promotions. Deployments. Funerals. Homecomings. Victories no civilian would ever hear about. And now somehow it marked this too. Reclamation. I adjusted the ribbons across my chest and looked at my reflection. The woman staring back looked older than she had 2 weeks earlier. Not physically. Something deeper. As though betrayal had burned away the last traces of someone who still believed love could be earned through performance. Outside, Virginia's early sunlight spilled across the motel parking lot. Colonel Mercer was waiting beside his truck, coffee in hand. He looked me over and gave one sharp nod. About time the Army remembered who you are. That made me smile. The drive to Fort Belvoir was quiet. Mercer understood the value of silence. Older soldiers know that some moments deserve room to settle. When we reached post, military police waved us through the gate with formal salutes. A week earlier, another set of MPS had stripped my authority at my apartment door. Now those same gates opened to welcome me back. Life has a way of restoring balance when truth finally catches up. The ceremony was held in the command auditorium. Nothing extravagant. 100 seats. Flags arranged at the front. Rows of officers and civilian staff already seated when I entered. The room rose as one. For a moment I stopped walking. I hadn't expected that. General Whitaker stood near the podium. He met my eyes and gave the slightest nod. It wasn't ceremony. It was respect. I moved forward and took my place. The general's remarks were brief and direct. He spoke about duty, integrity, the cost of institutional failure when good people are doubted too quickly. Then he turned toward me. Major Abigail Reeves acted exactly as an officer should. Her vigilance exposed one of the most serious procurement fraud operations this command has seen in decades. His voice sharpened. We failed her before verifying the truth. That failure will not happen again. The room was utterly still. Then he pinned the Legion of Merit medal to my jacket. As his hand withdrew, he said quietly enough that only I could hear, "You honored the uniform better than we honored you." Emotion rose so suddenly I nearly lost my composure. But Army discipline held. I saluted. He returned it. The applause that followed was long and steady. And all I could think was this. My father had spent 40 years teaching me that approval had to be earned through perfection. Yet here among people who had every reason to judge harshly acknowledgement had arrived not because I was flawless, but because I had endured truthfully. After the ceremony, officers approached one by one. Some apologized. Some simply shook my hand. Others said nothing at all, their expressions carrying more sincerity than words ever could. Then I saw my phone. 32 missed calls. 20 from my parents. One voicemail had arrived during the ceremony. I stepped into an empty hallway and played it. Dad's voice came through rough and uneven. Abigail, the sheriff posted final foreclosure papers this morning. A shaky breath followed. We have 48 hours. Silence. Then, I know I don't deserve to ask this, but your mother's terrified. His voice cracked. And suddenly, impossibly, I heard not the commanding father of my childhood, but an aging man confronting consequences he no longer knew how to control. He continued. I was wrong about everything. A pause. Then the sentence that undid me. I was so afraid of being ashamed of you, I never noticed how proud I should have been. The voicemail ended. I stood there staring at the blank screen. For years, those were the words I had wanted. A child can survive on very little hope if she believes love is still possible. And now here they were arriving decades late and spoken through defeat. Colonel Mercer found me standing there. He read my expression immediately. What happened? I handed him the phone. He listened quietly. When it ended, he looked up. What are you thinking? I stared down the long, polished hallway of Fort Belvoir, at young officers walking briskly toward work, at the life I had fought to reclaim. Then I answered honestly, I think I'm tired of letting pain make my decisions. Mercer said nothing. He didn't need to. By afternoon, I was driving north to Maryland. The highway stretched ahead beneath a pale autumn sky. Every mile carried memory. Family road trips. High school debates with my father. The long drive home after West Point graduation when he had said, not bad, like it was praise enough to last a lifetime. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, dusk had settled. The foreclosure notice was taped to the front door. The American flag still hung neatly from the porch. But the house itself looked smaller somehow. Fragile. Like pride had been the only thing holding it upright. I stepped out of the car. And for the first time in my life, I approached that front door with nothing left to prove. The porch light was already on when I walked up the front steps. For a second, my hand hovered over the same brass doorbell I had pressed a week earlier. That morning, I had stood here frightened, disgraced, and desperate for comfort. Tonight, I stood here restored. Not because the army had cleared my name. Not because the uniform on my shoulders carried fresh recognition. But because somewhere between losing everything and getting it back, I had stopped measuring my worth by whether this door opened for me. I pressed the bell. Footsteps shuffled inside. Then the door opened. My father looked smaller than I remembered. Frank Reeves had always filled a room through sheer force of certainty. Even in retirement, he carried himself like a man who believed control was his birthright. That certainty was gone now. His shoulders sagged. His neatly combed gray hair looked thinner. The skin beneath his eyes had hollowed into shadows. And when he saw me standing there in full dress blues, his face folded in on itself. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped aside. Please come in. The house smelled exactly as it had my entire childhood lemon polish old books and my mother's lavender hand soap. The familiarity hit harder than I expected. Memory is a strange thing. It can ache even when attached to pain. Mom stood in the living room near the fireplace, twisting a handkerchief between trembling fingers. The moment she saw me, tears spilled down her cheeks. Abby. I gave a small nod. Not cold. Not warm. Simply present. She crossed the room and stopped a few feet away as though uncertain she had the right to come closer. That hurt more than anger would have. Because it meant she knew what she'd done. We sat in the living room where I had opened Christmas gifts as a child and studied for SAT exams under my father's stern supervision. Now silence filled every corner. Finally, Dad spoke. The bank accelerated the foreclosure after Redstone's assets were frozen. I frowned. What does Redstone have to do with your mortgage? His expression tightened. Then shame darkened his face. Years seemed to settle into him all at once. He looked suddenly old. 3 years ago, he said quietly, I invested our retirement funds with a private equity group. A sick feeling stirred in my stomach. He kept going. They promised stable returns, conservative growth. They were backed through Redstone affiliates. Of course they were. Contractor shell money laundering often flowed through respectable-looking retirement instruments. For older investors, it was a familiar trap trust, the polished men with brochures and percentages. Dad stared at his hands. When your account became accessible, I used it to cover our mortgage while waiting for the investments to recover. I felt something inside me go still. Not rage. Not even shock. Just clarity. For years, he had quietly depended on my money while presenting himself as the provider. The man who had lectured me about responsibility had been surviving on my sacrifices while calling it family stewardship. Mom's voice broke through. I knew some of it. I looked at her. She wept openly now. I told myself he'd fix it. I told myself families help each other. But I knew it wasn't right. There it was. The truth at last. Not monsters. Not villains. Just frightened people whose pride had slowly made cowards of them. Dad looked up at me then, and his voice cracked. I emptied your account because I panicked. He swallowed hard. When the military investigation hit the news, I thought everything would be seized. I thought if I protected what was left. What was left, I asked quietly. He flinched. The question hung there. What was left after years of taking from a daughter he had never truly seen? Tears filled his eyes. The sight stunned me. Frank Reeves did not cry. Not when his own father died. Not when Mom survived breast cancer. Not when I deployed to Afghanistan. But now tears slipped down his face unchecked. And he whispered the words I never thought I would hear. I threw away my child to save a house and still lost both. The room went silent. I looked at this man who had shaped so much of my life through absence disguised as discipline. And for the first time I saw him clearly. Not as the giant whose approval I had chased. Not as the judge whose standards defined me. Just an aging man who had spent his life worshipping control until it cost him the very people he meant to protect. And suddenly I pitied him. Real pity. Not contempt. Not triumph. Mercy. I stood. Both of them looked up frightened I was leaving. Instead, I walked to the front window and looked out at the dark street where I'd once learned to ride a bicycle under my father's watchful eye. Then I turned back. I can stop the foreclosure. Neither of them moved. Dad's face drained of color. Why? It was a fair question. After everything, why? I thought about Colonel Mercer's words. Forgiveness and access are not the same thing. Then I answered. Because if I let bitterness decide who I become, then this wins twice. Mom covered her mouth and sobbed. Dad stared at me like he no longer recognized the daughter standing before him. Maybe he didn't. The frightened girl who once begged for scraps of his approval was gone. In her place stood a woman who had finally learned this. Mercy offered freely is not weakness. It is freedom. The next morning I wired enough money to halt proceedings. Not to erase the past. Not to pretend trust was restored overnight. But to make room for something better than revenge. That evening, after the paperwork cleared, Dad met me at the front door as I prepared to leave. His eyes were red. His hands shook slightly. For a moment he said nothing. Then very softly he spoke my full name. Welcome home, Abigail Reeves. Not ownership. Not expectation. Just pride. At last freely given. I smiled. And this time when he opened his arms I stepped into them. Some wounds never fully disappear. But healing begins the moment we stop asking pain to tell us who we are. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you've ever had to choose grace when anger felt easier, I hope you'll carry that reflection with you, and perhaps share it with someone who needs it. And if stories like this remind you that it's never too late for truth healing and second chances, I'd be honored if you stayed for the next one.